darkness held secrets that October night, secrets that would change everything. Young Willem stood at the foot of Shadowmere Castle's ancient watchtower, the brass key trembling in his palm as mist rolled across the Yorkshire moors like the breath of sleeping giants. At 19, he was the youngest man ever appointed to the sacred duty of night watchman, chosen not for his years, but for something deeper, a quality that Master Edwin, his predecessor, had recognized in the boy's quiet, observant nature. The castle chooses its own guardians, Edwin had whispered on his deathbed just 3 days prior. Listen to the stones, Willem. They have stories to tell, and you have the ears to hear them. The iron-reinforced oak door groaned as Willem pushed it open, stepping into the circular chamber that would become his world between sunset and dawn. The room smelled of centuries, beeswax, old wool, stone dust, and something else, something indefinable that spoke of accumulated years and accumulated secrets. A single table dominated the space, its oak surface scarred by decades of use. Upon it lay the watchman's sacred tools, a leather-bound journal with brass clasps, an inkwell of black walnut, several goose quill pens, and most importantly, a brass oil lamp whose flame had been passed down from watchman to watchman for over 2 centuries. Willem's hands shook as he lit the lamp with the taper he'd carried from the great hall below. The golden light pushed back the shadows, revealing stone walls marked by time and weather, their surfaces telling stories in scratches and stains that only patient eyes could read. As he opened the journal to its first blank page, Willem felt the weight of tradition settling around him like a cloak. Every night, Watchman of Shadowmere Castle had made his entries in this very book, recording not just the mundane details of security and weather, but the deeper mysteries that revealed themselves only to those who stood guard while the world slept. With careful script, Willem began his first entry. First watch of Willem de Ashford, appointed this day by his lordship Edmund de Montclair to serve as guardian of the night. October 31st, in the year of our Lord, 1348. The mist rises thick from the moors tonight, and the very air seems to whisper of changes coming. Master Edwin's words echo still in my mind. The castle chooses its own. I pray I prove worthy of this sacred trust. As Willem set down his quill, a sound reached his ears that made his blood chill, the slow, measured toll of a bell. But not just any bell. The deep, resonant voice that echoed through the mist was unmistakably that of St. Dunstan's bell, the massive bronze instrument that hung in the abbey ruins 5 miles to the east. Willem's brow furrowed in confusion. St. Dunstan's Abbey had been abandoned for over 50 years, its bells silent since the last monk departed for safer lands. There was no one left to ring that bell, no rope remaining to pull, no reason for its voice to sound across the moorland night. Yet there it tolled, 13 times, the traditional number that marked the passage of a soul from the world of the living to whatever lay beyond. Willem rose from his chair and moved to the narrow window that faced east. The thick glass, imported at great expense from the craftsmen of Venice, was fogged with condensation from the autumn mist. He wiped it clear with his sleeve and peered into the gray shroud that had swallowed the landscape. In the distance, barely visible through the shifting fog, Willem thought he saw a light. Not the warm yellow of torch fire or candle flame, but a cold blue radiance that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The light appeared to be moving, floating perhaps 20 feet above the ground, tracing a path that Willem somehow knew led directly from the abbey ruins toward Shadowmere Castle. As he watched, transfixed by the impossible sight, the light began to grow brighter and closer. Other lights joined it, first one, then another, then dozens, until a procession of ethereal blue flames was winding its way across the moor like a river of stars fallen to earth. Willem's rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that mist and moonlight were playing tricks with his young eyes. But something deeper, some instinct that had slumbered in his blood until this moment, recognized the truth of what he was witnessing. But I haven't told you yet what Willem discovered when the lights reached the castle walls. The procession of blue flames moved with purpose and deliberation, following paths that had been worn into the landscape centuries before Willem's birth. As they drew closer to Shadowmere Castle, Willem could see that each light was not merely fire, but something far more profound, a luminous presence that suggested consciousness, memory, purpose. The lights paused at the base of the castle's outer wall, their cold radiance casting strange shadows on the ancient stones. Then, one by one, they began to ascend, not climbing the walls, but simply rising through the air as if the very concept of solid matter was no barrier to their passage. Willem watched in breathless wonder as the first light crested the battlements and drifted into the courtyard below. The others followed, creating a slow, solemn dance of illumination that transformed the familiar spaces of the castle into something from a dream or vision. Unable to contain his curiosity, Willem grabbed his cloak and made his way down the spiral staircase of the watchtower. The stone steps were slick with moisture from the mist that seemed to penetrate even the thickest walls. Each footfall echoed in the narrow space, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the very air had grown thicker, more resistant to the normal laws of sound and movement. The door at the base of the tower opened onto the castle's inner courtyard, a space Willem had crossed countless times during his years as a page and squire. But tonight, the familiar was transformed into the fantastic. The blue lights hung suspended in the air throughout the courtyard, their radiance revealing details that Willem had never noticed before. The stones of the well at the courtyard's center bore carved symbols that seemed to shift and change in the ethereal light. The wooden doors of the various buildings around the perimeter glowed as if lit from within. Even the bare earth beneath Willem's feet seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. As Willem stood marveling at the transformation, one of the lights began to descend toward him. He fought the urge to flee, remembering Master Edwin's words about listening to what the castle had to tell him. As the light drew closer, Willem could see that it was not merely illumination, but something far more substantial, a presence that carried within it the essence of memory, personality, humanity. The light settled before Willem like a gentle flame, and from within its blue radiance, a figure began to emerge. At first, it was little more than a suggestion, the outline of a human form traced in luminous mist. But gradually, features became clear. The face of a woman, beautiful and kind, wearing robes that spoke of noble birth and holy purpose. "Fear not, young Willem," the figure said, her voice like wind through cathedral bells. "I am Sister Catherine, who served in St. Dunstan's Abbey during the years when faith still flourished in this land. We come not to harm, but to welcome, to acknowledge one who has been chosen for a purpose greater than the simple keeping of watch." Willem found his voice at last, though it emerged as little more than a whisper. "Sister Catherine, but the abbey has been empty for 53 years, 2 months, and 17 days, the nun completed with a gentle smile. "Yes, we know. We have been counting each one, waiting for the time when the old barriers would weaken enough to allow us to return to the work we left unfinished." Around the courtyard, more figures were emerging from the blue lights, monks in simple brown robes, Knights in ancient armor, ladies in gowns that spoke of centuries past, all bore the same luminous quality, all moved with the same sense of purpose and peace. "What work?" Willem asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Sister Catherine gestured toward the castle around them, her movement causing ripples of blue light to flow through the air like water. "Shadowmere Castle stands upon ground that has been sacred since before the first stones were laid," she explained. "Long before Norman lords claimed this land, before Saxon kings ruled these moors, this place was a sanctuary, a thin spot where the world of the living touched the realm of eternal rest." She moved closer to Willem, and he could feel the cold radiance that surrounded her, not unpleasant, but utterly unlike anything he had ever experienced. The castle was built not merely as a fortress, but as a guardian of that sanctity. Each stone was blessed, each timber consecrated, each act of construction performed with reverence for the sacred nature of the ground. And here, Willem began to understand the true nature of his inheritance. As Sister Catherine spoke, the other luminous figures gathered around them in the courtyard, their presence transforming the mundane space into something that felt more like the nave of a great cathedral. Willem could see now that they represented not just the recent dead, but souls from across the centuries, warriors who had died defending the castle, priests who had blessed its halls, servants who had given their lives in faithful service to its noble purpose. "For 800 years," Sister Catherine continued, "the castle has stood as a beacon of hope in a world that grows ever darker. Wars have raged around it, plagues have swept the land, but Shadowmere has remained untouched, protected by forces that most of the living cannot see or understand." An elderly monk stepped forward from the gathering, his face bearing the marks of great learning and deep compassion. "I am Brother Thomas, who served as the castle's first chaplain when these walls were young. The protection that guards this place is not magic in the sense that common folk understand it, but rather a manifestation of accumulated faith, hope, and love. Human emotions so pure and strong that they have taken on a life of their own." Willem turned slowly, taking in the faces that surrounded him. Each one bore the marks of their earthly life, the calloused hands of a master mason, the ink stains on a scribe's fingers, the scars of battle on a knight's brow. But all were transfigured by the same ethereal peace. "You speak as if this protection requires maintenance," Willem said, beginning to grasp the implications of what he was hearing. "All things require maintenance," replied a figure Willem recognized as Sir Geoffrey de Montclair, the first Lord of Shadowmere, though he had died 3 centuries before Willem's birth. "Stone must be repaired, timber must be replaced, and faith must be tended like a garden, nurtured with care and devotion, or it withers and dies." Sister Catherine nodded gravely. "That is the true purpose of the night watch, Willem, not merely to guard against thieves and enemies, but to maintain the spiritual foundation upon which this castle stands. Each night, as you walk these walls and halls, you strengthen the bonds that hold the protection in place. Each prayer you offer, each act of devotion you perform, each moment of genuine love you feel for this place adds another thread to the tapestry that shields Shadowmere from the darkness." The implications of her words settled over Willem like a heavy cloak. He was not just a simple guard, but a priest of sorts, a keeper of mysteries that stretched back across centuries of human hope and faith. "What happens if I fail?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the battlements. The assembled spirits exchanged glances that spoke of concerns too weighty for simple words. Finally, Brother Thomas stepped forward again. Even now, forces gather in the east that would devour not just bodies and buildings, but the very essence of human hope, he said. A great plague comes, Willem, not just of the flesh, but of the spirit. Places where love and faith have grown weak will fall not just to disease, but to a deeper corruption that will leave them empty of all that makes life worth living. Sir Geoffrey raised his armored hand, pointing toward the eastern horizon, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to show. We have perhaps a year before this spiritual pestilence reaches these shores. In that time, you must learn not just to maintain the castle's protection, but to strengthen it beyond anything we have achieved before. The choice of whether Shadowmere stands as a sanctuary for all who seek refuge, or falls to become another hollow shell, rests now in your hands. The gathering began to fade as the dawn light grew stronger, the blue radiance that surrounded each figure growing paler and more translucent. But before they vanished entirely, Sister Catherine approached Willem one final time. "Tomorrow night, we will begin your true education," she said. "You will learn the history of this place, the nature of the forces that protect it, and the rituals that can strengthen those forces. But know this, young Willem, you are not alone in this burden. We who have gone before watch over you still, ready to offer guidance and strength when the darkest hour comes." As the last of the spirits faded into the morning mist, Willem stood alone in the courtyard, surrounded by the familiar stones and timber of his childhood home. But everything had changed. The very air seemed to hum with hidden energy, and every shadow held the promise of wonders yet to be revealed. Returning to his tower chamber, Willem took up his quill with hands that no longer trembled and made his second entry in the journal. First watch completed. All is well within the walls. The mist has lifted with the dawn, and the castle prepares for another day. I begin to understand that my true education has only just begun, and I am grateful for the wisdom of those who came before. He did not write of the blue lights or the gathering of spirits. Some truths, he sensed, were not meant for ink and parchment, but were to be carried in the heart and soul of those chosen to bear their weight. But as the days passed and Willem settled into his new role, he began to discover that the castle held far more secrets than a single night could reveal. The weeks that followed Willem's first encounter with the spirits of Shadowmere passed in a rhythm that was both familiar and strange. By day, he slept in his small chamber at the base of the watchtower, his dreams filled with blue lights and whispered words of ancient wisdom. By evening, he would break his fast with the other servants in the great hall, listening to their cheerful gossip about crops and weather, marriages and births, all the simple concerns of mortal life that seemed somehow distant now from his own experience. But it was during his night watches that Willem's true education began to unfold. Each evening, as darkness settled over the castle and the last servants made their way to their beds, the spirits would begin to appear. Not all at once, as they had on that first extraordinary night, but gradually, as if testing Willem's readiness to receive their teachings. The first to become a regular visitor was Brother Thomas, the elderly monk whose gentle wisdom and patient explanations made him an ideal teacher for a young man still struggling to understand the magnitude of what he had inherited. "Knowledge is like a great tapestry," Brother Thomas explained on Willem's fifth night of duty as they stood together on the battlements overlooking the moonlit moors. Each thread must be woven carefully into place, or the whole fabric will be weakened. tonight, we begin with the first thread, the history of this sacred ground. The old monk gestured toward the landscape below, and Willem gasped as the familiar view transformed before his eyes. The rolling hills and sparse woodlands that he had known since childhood shimmered and shifted, revealing glimpses of what had existed in ages past. Before your ancestors crossed the narrow sea, before the Romans built their roads, even before the ancient Celts raised their stone circles, this land was recognized as a place of power, Brother Thomas said. The first people to settle here were drawn by dreams and visions, called by forces they could not name but dared not ignore. Willem watched in wonder as ghostly images appeared and vanished across the landscape. Circles of standing stones, groves of sacred oak, pools of water that reflected not the sky above, but lights from realms beyond mortal sight. Each generation that came to this place added their own layer of reverence and protection, Brother Thomas continued. The Celts built their temple where the castle's chapel now stands. The Romans constructed a way station for pilgrims traveling to sacred sites throughout Britain. The Saxons raised a monastery, and when that was destroyed by Viking raids, they rebuilt it stronger than before. The vision shifted and changed, showing Willem glimpses of these ancient structures superimposed upon the familiar outline of Shadowmere Castle. He could see how each generation had built upon the work of their predecessors, not merely adding stones and timber, but weaving their own faith and hope into the spiritual fabric of the place. And when your Lord Edmund's great-great-grandfather claimed this land, he was guided not by conquest, but by calling, Brother Thomas said. He knew, though he could not have explained how he knew, that his purpose was not to destroy what had come before, but to perfect it, to create a stronghold that would protect not just bodies, but souls. The visions faded as clouds passed over the moon, returning the landscape to its familiar, mortal appearance. But Willem could still feel the weight of all that history beneath his feet, layer upon layer of human hope and devotion that had accumulated over millennia. This is why the watch matters, Willem, Brother Thomas said softly. Every night that you walk these walls with reverence and dedication, you add another thread to that great tapestry. Every prayer you offer, every moment of wonder you experience, every act of faithful service strengthens the protection that guards not just this castle, but all who seek refuge within its influence. On the seventh night, Sister Catherine returned to continue Willem's education. Sister Catherine appeared to Willem as he was making his midnight round of the castle's interior chambers, her blue radiance casting ethereal shadows on the familiar stones of the great hall. Unlike Brother Thomas's patient, scholarly approach, the former nun brought a sense of urgency to her teachings that reflected the approaching danger she and her companions had warned of. Brother Thomas has shown you the roots, she said without preamble. Now you must understand the branches, the active measures that maintain and strengthen the castle's protection. She led Willem to the great hearth that dominated one wall of the hall, its massive stones blackened by centuries of fires. But as Sister Catherine gestured toward the cold ashes, Willem saw something that made his breath catch, the outline of symbols carved into the stone, so ancient and weathered that they were nearly invisible to ordinary sight. Every element of this castle's construction carries meaning beyond the merely practical, Sister Catherine explained. The hearth is not just for warmth, but serves as the heart of the castle's spiritual circulatory system. Watch. As she spoke, the cold ashes began to glow with the same blue light that surrounded the spirits. The glow spread outward from the hearth, tracing lines through the floor that Willem had never noticed before. channels carved into the very stones that formed an intricate pattern throughout the great hall. "These are the paths of blessing," Sister Catherine said. "They carry the spiritual energy generated by acts of love, hope, and faith throughout the castle, ensuring that every corner is protected. But like any pathway, they require maintenance." Willem knelt and placed his hand on one of the glowing channels. He could feel a subtle vibration, like the pulse of a great heart, running through the stone. But the sensation was faint, weak, as if whatever power had once flowed here was slowly fading. "The channels have grown weak," he said, understanding flooding through him. "Yes," Sister Catherine confirmed. "For generations, the lords of Shadowmere understood their role as more than military commanders or political leaders. They were priests of a sort, keepers of rituals that maintained the spiritual strength of their domain. But recent generations have forgotten these duties, focusing only on worldly concerns." She gestured around the great hall, and Willem could see how neglect had crept into spaces that should have been maintained with reverence. Tapestries that should have been replaced hung faded and moth-eaten. Candle holders that should have held blessed flames stood empty. Even the rushes on the floor lacked the sacred herbs that previous generations had woven among them. "This is your first great task," Sister Catherine said. "You must restore the paths of blessing to their former strength, not through grand gestures or expensive renovations, but through daily acts of devotion and care. Each night, as you make your rounds, you must tend to these channels like a gardener tends to his plants." She showed Willem how to recognize the signs of spiritual decline, the way shadows gathered in corners where light should naturally fall, the subtle sense of coldness that had nothing to do with weather, the way sounds seemed muffled and distant, even in spaces that should have carried echoes clearly. "How do I restore them?" Willem asked. Sister Catherine smiled, her expression holding both sadness and hope. "With the same forces that created them, love, faith, and dedicated service. Each act of genuine care you perform within these walls adds strength to the channels. Each prayer you offer with true devotion brightens their light. Each moment of wonder and gratitude you experience while walking your watch weaves new threads into the protective tapestry." But Willem's education was about to take an even more profound turn. On Willem's 10th night as Watchman, Sir Geoffrey de Montclair himself appeared, his ancient armor gleaming with the same ethereal light that surrounded all the spirits. The First Lord of Shadowmere carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, but his eyes held a depth of wisdom that spoke of centuries spent contemplating mysteries beyond mortal understanding. "You have learned of the castle's past and its present needs," Sir Geoffrey said, his voice carrying the authority of nobility, tempered by centuries of spiritual growth. "Now you must understand its future, and your role in shaping that future." He led Willem to the castle's highest tower, a circular chamber that had once served as the Lord's private study, but had been abandoned for decades. As they climbed the narrow spiral staircase, Willem felt the air growing thicker, more charged with energy, as if they were ascending not just through space, but through layers of reality itself. The chamber at the tower's peak was bare of furnishings, its windows offering a commanding view in all directions. But as Sir Geoffrey raised his luminous hand, the empty space transformed into something far more significant. A map room where the very air became a three-dimensional representation of the spiritual geography of the region. Willem gasped as he saw threads of light stretching out from Shadowmere Castle like the spokes of a great wheel, connecting it to dozens of other points across the British Isles. Some of these connections glowed brightly, while others flickered weakly or had gone completely dark. "This is the true map of our realm," Sir Geoffrey explained. "Not the political boundaries that kings and lords contest, but the spiritual network that determines whether civilization thrives or withers. Each point of light represents a place where human hope and faith have taken root. Abbeys, castles, manor houses, even simple village churches where genuine devotion is practiced." Willem studied the map with growing understanding and alarm. The bright connections were clustered primarily in the north and west, while vast dark areas stretched across the eastern and southern regions. "The plague you warned of, it's already begun its work," Willem said. Sir Geoffrey nodded gravely. "The spiritual corruption spreads faster than any physical disease, traveling along lines of fear and despair, feeding on doubt and hopelessness. Look." As Willem watched, some of the dimmer lights flickered and went out entirely, their loss causing the remaining connections to stretch and strain. He could see that Shadowmere Castle occupied a crucial position in this network. If it fell, a vast section of the spiritual map would be left dark and unprotected. "But there is hope," Sir Geoffrey continued, gesturing toward a handful of points that glowed even brighter than before. "Some places are not merely maintaining their protection, but actively strengthening it. These beacons can serve as anchors for the entire network, sending out healing energy to restore connections that have been severed." Willem's heart quickened as he understood the implication. "You want Shadowmere to become one of these beacons." "Not want, need," Sir Geoffrey corrected. "The spiritual geography of this realm has shifted, Willem. Shadowmere now stands at a crossroads of ancient paths. If we can strengthen its protection beyond anything achieved before, it can serve as a lighthouse that guides lost souls to safety and sends healing energy throughout the network." The ghostly lord moved to one of the tower's windows, gazing out over the moonlit landscape. "This is why you were chosen, Willem. Not because you are the oldest or most experienced, but because you possess something rarer. The ability to see beyond the physical world to the spiritual truths that underlie all existence." Willem joined him at the window, looking out over lands that he now understood carried a burden and a potential far greater than he had ever imagined. "What must I do?" Sir Geoffrey smiled, the expression transforming his austere features with warmth and approval. "You must become more than a night watchman, Willem. You must become a guardian of the light itself, a keeper of the sacred flame that can turn Shadowmere Castle into a beacon of hope for all who struggle against the encroaching darkness." And so began the most intensive period of Willem's education, as the spirits of Shadowmere revealed the deepest mysteries of their sacred trust. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Willem could have imagined when he first accepted the simple duty of night watchman. Each evening brought new teachers, new revelations, new challenges that tested not just his understanding, but his very soul. Brother Marcus, a learned monk who had served as the castle's librarian 2 centuries past, taught Willem to read the subtle signs that revealed the spiritual health of different areas within the castle. They would walk the corridors together, the ghost's ethereal light revealing symbols and patterns that had been invisible to mortal eyes. "See how the light gathers here," Brother Marcus would say, pointing to certain stones in a wall. "This marks a place where many prayers have been offered, where genuine devotion has accumulated over time. But notice how it dims as we approach this corner. Here, some act of selfishness or cruelty has left a shadow that still weakens the overall harmony." Willem learned to recognize these variations by feel as well as sight, developing an almost supernatural sensitivity to the spiritual atmosphere of different spaces. He could walk into a room and immediately sense whether it contributed to the castle's protection or detracted from it. Sister Margaret, who had served as healer to the castle's inhabitants during the harsh winter of 1203, taught Willem the connection between physical and spiritual wellness. She showed him how the health of the castle's residents, both living and dead, affected the strength of its protection. Fear and despair are like poison to the spiritual body, she explained as they visited the quarters where the castle's servants slept. A single person consumed by hopelessness can create a crack in the protective barrier that allows corruption to seep in. But equally, one soul filled with genuine joy and love can strengthen the entire foundation. Willem began to understand why Master Edwin had always taken such personal interest in the welfare of every person within the castle walls. It wasn't mere kindness, it was spiritual necessity. The night watchman served not just as guardian of walls and gates, but as shepherd to the community whose collective spiritual health determined whether the castle remained a sanctuary or became vulnerable to attack. Perhaps the most challenging teacher was Dame Isabella, who had been Lady of Shadowmere during its darkest hour, the siege of 1312, when enemy forces had surrounded the castle for 3 full months. Her lessons focused on active resistance to spiritual corruption, the techniques by which a trained guardian could not only maintain protection, but actively drive back forces that sought to destroy it. Passive faith is not enough when the darkness presses close, Dame Isabella taught, her luminous form surrounded by an aura of fierce determination that Willem could feel like heat from a forge. There are times when a guardian must become a warrior, wielding weapons of light against enemies that seek to devour hope itself. She showed Willem exercises that seemed more like martial arts than religious practice, sequences of movement and breathing that could focus his spiritual energy into a force capable of cleansing corrupted spaces or driving back malevolent influences. The practice left Willem exhausted but exhilarated, his body aching while his soul felt strengthened beyond measure. But it was the final phase of Willem's education that revealed the true magnitude of his destiny. On the night of the winter solstice, 6 weeks after Willem's first encounter with the spirits of Shadowmere, all of his teachers gathered together in the castle's chapel for what they called the revelation of the sacred flame. Willem had been instructed to fast for 3 days in preparation, drinking only blessed water and eating only bread that had been baked with flour ground from grain grown on the castle's own lands. The chapel, which during daylight hours seemed like a simple stone building with wooden pews and a modest altar, transformed in the presence of the assembled spirits into something that resembled a cathedral from a vision of paradise. The air itself glowed with accumulated holiness, and Willem could hear harmonies that seemed to come from every stone and timber, as if the building itself was singing. At the altar, where during ordinary services a simple wooden cross stood, there now blazed a flame unlike anything Willem had ever imagined. It was not blue like the light that surrounded the spirits, nor golden like ordinary fire, but white, pure, brilliant white that contained all colors and none, all warmth and all coolness, all light and all the gentle darkness of peaceful rest. "This is the sacred flame," Sir Geoffrey announced, his voice filled with reverence that spoke of centuries of worship. "It has burned here since the first stones of this chapel were blessed, fed not by wood or oil, but by the pure devotion of all who have served this place with love." Sister Catherine stepped forward, her hands extended toward the flame in a gesture of offering. Every act of genuine service, every moment of selfless love, every prayer offered with true faith adds fuel to this fire. It is the heart of Shadowmere's protection, the source of the light that flows through the paths of blessing, the anchor that holds our spiritual defenses firm against all assaults. Willem approached the altar slowly, feeling the intensity of the flame's radiance increase with each step. When he was close enough to touch the altar's stone surface, he could feel power flowing through the ancient rock like blood through living veins. "What is my role in relation to this flame?" Willem asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Brother Thomas smiled with paternal pride. "You are its guardian, Willem, its protector and its priest. Through your faithful service, the flame burns brighter. Through your daily acts of devotion, its influence spreads further. And when the time comes, as it will come, sooner than we might wish, you will become its voice, its hands, its presence in the world of the living." Dame Isabella stepped closer to Willem, her expression serious, but not unkind. "The plague of spiritual corruption that we have warned you about draws closer each day. Already, the outer edges of our protective influence are being tested by forces that seek to snuff out every light of hope in this realm. Soon, very soon, Shadowmere Castle will face its greatest trial." Willem felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. "What will be required of me?" Sir Geoffrey gestured toward the sacred flame, its white radiance dancing with eternal life. "You will need to carry this flame beyond these walls, Willem, to take its light to places where darkness has gained a foothold and restore them to the network of protection. You will become a traveling guardian, a knight-errant of the spirit, spreading the flame's influence across the land." The implications of this revelation settled over Willem like a heavy cloak. He had thought his calling was to guard Shadowmere Castle, but now he understood that the castle was merely his base. His true mission was to serve as a beacon of hope for all of Britain. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Willem admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Sister Catherine approached him with infinite gentleness, placing her ethereal hand over his heart. Though her touch was cool, Willem could feel warmth spreading through his chest, not the warmth of physical comfort, but something far deeper and more sustaining. "You are not alone, Willem," she said softly. "We who have gone before will be with you always, lending our strength to yours. And more than that, the flame itself will guide you, protect you, and provide you with power beyond anything you can imagine." She gestured toward the altar, where the sacred flame pulsed with increased brightness. "Tomorrow night, you will undergo the rite of consecration. You will be transformed from a simple night watchman into something far greater. A guardian of the sacred flame, a knight of the eternal watch, a warrior in the greatest battle that will ever be fought on this earth." And as Willem prepared for this ultimate transformation, the forces of darkness drew ever closer to Shadowmere's borders. The day of the winter solstice passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation for Willem. He spent the morning hours in meditation and prayer, following instructions that Brother Thomas had given him for purifying his mind and spirit. The afternoon was devoted to physical preparation, bathing in water blessed by all the saints whose relics were housed in the castle's chapel, donning robes of undyed wool that had been woven by the nuns of a distant convent specifically for this purpose. But it was during the evening hours, as the sun set on the shortest day of the year, that Willem began to sense the approach of something vast and threatening from beyond the castle's protective boundaries. The very air seemed to thicken with malevolent presence, and even the cheerful chatter of the servants in the great hall was subdued, as if everyone could feel the oppressive weight of gathering doom. As Willem climbed the stairs to the chapel for the rite of consecration, he could hear sounds from outside the castle walls that chilled his blood. Howling that was not quite wind, footsteps that were not quite human, voices that spoke in languages older and more terrible than any mortal tongue. The assembled spirits were already waiting when Willem entered the chapel, but tonight they appeared different, more solid, more present, as if the approaching crisis had strengthened their connection to the world of the living. The sacred flame blazed higher than Willem had ever seen it, its white radiance pushing back shadows that seemed unusually dark and resistant to ordinary light. "The vanguard of the corruption has arrived," Sir Geoffrey announced without preamble. "They test our defenses even now, seeking weaknesses they can exploit when their full force arrives with the dawn." Willem moved to one of the chapel windows and peered out into the night. What he saw made his heart pound with terror and determination in equal measure. The familiar landscape around Shadowmere Castle was transformed into a battleground between light and darkness. Shapes moved in the mist that defied description, things that might once have been human, but had been twisted into forms of pure malevolence by the spiritual plague that consumed hope and love and left only hungry emptiness in their wake. They pressed against invisible barriers around the castle's walls, their touch causing sparks of blue fire where the protective influences resisted their corruption. "They cannot breach our defenses tonight," Dame Isabella said, joining Willem at the window. "But each assault weakens the barriers slightly. By tomorrow evening, if we have not acted to strengthen our position, they will break through." Willem turned back to face the altar, where the sacred flame danced with increased urgency. "Then let us begin the rite of consecration immediately." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Willem could have imagined, even after weeks of supernatural education. The assembled spirits formed a circle around the altar, their combined radiance turning the chapel into a nexus of spiritual power that seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. Brother Thomas approached Willem carrying a chalice that appeared to be carved from a single enormous pearl, its surface reflecting not the chapel around them, but visions of all the sacred places that had ever existed in the British Isles. The cup held water that glowed with the same white light as the sacred flame. "This is water from the holy well," Brother Thomas explained, referring to the legendary spring that was said to have appeared when Saint Joseph of Arimathea visited Britain and planted his staff in the sacred soil. "It has been blessed by saints and martyrs, and carries within it the accumulated holiness of 15 centuries of Christian devotion." Willem accepted the chalice with trembling hands and drank deeply. The water was unlike anything he had ever tasted, not simply wet, but somehow nourishing to parts of his being that he hadn't known existed. As it flowed down his throat, Willem felt his entire body begin to glow with inner light, as if the sacred flame itself was now burning within his heart. Sister Catherine stepped forward, carrying what appeared to be a simple brown rope, but Willem could see that it pulsed with the same white radiance as everything else connected to the sacred flame. "This is the cord of St. Francis," she said. "Worn by the great saint himself during his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, it carries his dedication to poverty, humility, and service to all creation." As she tied the cord around Willem's waist, Willem felt his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his individual identity. Suddenly, he could sense the spiritual condition of every living thing within miles of the castle. The fear of animals fleeing the approaching corruption, the confusion of village folk who felt threatened by something they couldn't name, the grim determination of the corrupted beings that pressed against the castle's defenses. Sir Geoffrey approached carrying a sword unlike any weapon Willem had ever seen. Its blade was not metal, but crystallized light, solid yet translucent, sharp enough to cut through spiritual as well as physical matter. The hilt was carved from wood taken from the Tree of Life itself, and bore inscriptions in a script that predated all human languages. "This is Dawnbreaker," Sir Geoffrey said with reverent ceremony, "forged not by human smiths but by angels themselves. It has the power to cleanse corruption wherever it strikes, and to kindle the sacred flame in places where light has been extinguished." As Willem's fingers closed around the sword's hilt, he felt power flow through him like lightning. But it was not destructive power. It was the force of creation itself, the energy that had spoken the world into being, and that sustained every act of love and hope and faith throughout the universe. And as the transformation reached its culmination, Willem finally understood the true nature of his calling. Brother Marcus stepped forward, carrying the final element of Willem's consecration, a book that seemed to be written in letters of living fire, its pages turning themselves to reveal text that wrote and rewrote itself, even as Willem watched. "This is the Chronicle of the Eternal Watch," Brother Marcus explained. "Within its pages are recorded all the deeds of those who have served as guardians of the sacred flame throughout history, and all the deeds of those who are yet to come. Your story begins tonight, Willem, but it will not end for centuries yet to come." As Willem opened the book, he saw his own name written in the same fiery script, followed by a list of accomplishments that took his breath away. According to the Chronicle, he was destined to restore 17 sacred sites to the network of protection, to kindle the sacred flame in 12 places where it had never burned before, and to inspire the founding of 7 new strongholds that would guard humanity's spiritual heritage for generations to come. But most remarkably, the Chronicle showed him that he would not undertake these tasks alone. As he read, Willem saw the names of others who would join him, men and women of every station and calling who would be drawn to serve the sacred flame's mission of preserving hope in a world increasingly consumed by despair. "You see now why you were chosen," Dame Isabella said with fierce pride. "Not because you were the strongest or most skilled, but because you carry within you the capacity to inspire others, to kindle the flame of devotion in hearts that have grown cold, to build bridges between the world of the living and the realm of eternal truth." Willem closed the Chronicle and looked around at the spirits who had become his teachers, his companions, his family in this sacred work. "I accept this calling," he said, his voice carrying a resonance it had never possessed before. "I will serve the sacred flame wherever it leads me, for as long as strength remains in my body and breath flows in my lungs." The moment he spoke these words, the chapel filled with light so brilliant that it seemed to shine through the very stones of the walls. Willem felt himself lifted from the ground, suspended in radiance that was somehow both gentle and overwhelming, while power flowed through every fiber of his being. When the light finally faded and Willem's feet touched the chapel floor again, he was no longer the same person who had climbed the stairs that evening. His simple woolen robes had been transformed into garments of white that seemed to weave themselves from moonbeams and starlight. The cord of St. Francis around his waist pulsed with golden light that matched the radiance now emanating from his skin. Dawnbreaker hung at his side like a piece of captured sunrise, and the Chronicle had become a part of his very being, its knowledge flowing through his mind like a river of wisdom. But Willem's first trial as a guardian of the sacred flame came immediately. Even as the echoes of the consecration ceremony faded, a sound reached the chapel that made every spirit present turn toward the windows with expressions of grave concern. It was the sound of stone cracking, not the natural settling that even the strongest walls experienced over time, but the deliberate fracturing caused by forces that sought to break through barriers that had stood for centuries. Willem rushed to the window and saw that the corrupted beings outside had somehow found a weakness in the castle's protective perimeter. Near the eastern gate, where the spiritual defenses had always been strongest, cracks of darkness were spreading across what had appeared to be empty air, revealing the invisible barriers that had kept the castle safe. "How is this possible?" Willem asked, though he could see that his teachers shared his alarm. Sir Geoffrey's expression was grim as he studied the spreading cracks. "They have found someone within our walls whose despair has grown so deep that it creates a conduit for their corruption. The protection that guards Shadowmere depends on the spiritual health of all who dwell within it. If even one person falls into complete hopelessness, it creates a weakness that our enemies can exploit." Willem's enhanced senses immediately began scanning the castle for the source of this spiritual breach. He could feel the presence like a wound in the fabric of the protective network. Someone in terrible pain, consumed by guilt or grief or fear so profound that it had opened their soul to the influence of the corrupting forces. "I'll find them," Willem said, moving toward the chapel door. "Wait," Sister Catherine called after him. "You must understand. Whoever has created this breach may not be acting voluntarily. The corruption that spreads from the east has many weapons, and one of the most insidious is its ability to amplify natural human emotions until they become doorways for invasion. You may find someone who is as much victim as threat." Willem nodded, understanding the complexity of what he faced. As a guardian of the sacred flame, his role was not to punish, but to heal, not to destroy, but to restore. Whatever he found in the castle's depths would require compassion as much as power. Leaving the spirits to maintain their vigil in the chapel, Willem made his way through the castle corridors, following the spiritual distress signals that led him deeper and deeper into the foundation chambers. The further he descended, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, until the very air seemed thick with accumulated sorrow and despair. Finally, in a storage chamber beneath the kitchens that Willem had never known existed, he found the source of the breach. Huddled against the far wall was a figure he recognized, young Thomas the scullery boy, barely 14 years old, who had been one of the brightest and most cheerful members of the castle's household. But the boy who looked up at Willem's approach was transformed by suffering into something barely recognizable. His eyes held depths of pain that no child should ever experience, and his body was surrounded by tendrils of shadow that pulsed with malevolent energy. "Thomas," Willem said gently, approaching slowly with his hands extended in a gesture of peace. "What has happened to you, my boy?" The answer came not in words, but in images that flooded Willem's enhanced consciousness. Visions of the boy's younger sister, who had died in the plague that had swept through their home village before Thomas came to the castle. The child's guilt at surviving when she had perished, his secret belief that he somehow deserved to die as well, had created an ocean of despair that the corrupting forces had found irresistible. "It's not your fault," Willem said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. "Your sister's death was not something you could have prevented, and your survival is not a betrayal of her memory." But the shadows around the boy only grew thicker, fed by months of self-hatred that had been carefully nurtured by influences beyond the castle's walls. Willem realized that words alone would not be enough to break the hold that despair had gained over young Thomas's soul. And so, Willem performed his first act as guardian of the sacred flame. Willem drew Dawnbreaker from its sheath, but not as a weapon. Instead, he held the crystalline blade before him like a candle, allowing its radiance to fill the chamber with the pure light of the sacred flame. The shadows that surrounded Thomas recoiled from the light, revealing the boy's true form beneath their influence. "Thomas," Willem said, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated with the frequency of hope itself. "Look into the light and see yourself as you truly are. Not a burden or a curse, but a precious child of creation, loved beyond measure by forces greater than you can imagine." As the boy's eyes focused on Dawnbreaker's radiance, Willem began to speak words that came not from his own knowledge, but from the chronicle that was now part of his being. Words of healing that had been spoken in moments of crisis throughout history. Prayers that could reach into the deepest darkness and kindle sparks of renewed hope. Gradually, the shadows began to lose their hold on Thomas's soul. The tendrils of corruption that had wrapped around his spirit started to dissolve, replaced by gentle light that soothed wounds that grief and guilt had carved into his heart. But Willem knew that healing the boy was only the first step. The breach in the castle's defenses had already allowed some of the corrupting influence to seep through, and those cracks would not close automatically when their source was eliminated. Still holding Dawnbreaker aloft, Willem began to walk slowly around the chamber, tracing patterns in the air with the sword's crystal blade. Where the weapon passed, lines of white fire appeared, burning away the corruption that had infiltrated this space and replacing it with barriers of pure protective energy. The process was exhausting. Willem could feel his own spiritual energy being drawn upon to fuel the cleansing fire. But gradually, the chamber was purified, its atmosphere restored to the same sense of peace and safety that characterized the rest of the castle. Young Thomas, freed from the shadows that had consumed him, collapsed into exhausted but peaceful sleep. Willem arranged the boy's cloak around him like a blanket, then made his way back to the chapel to report on his first success as a guardian of the sacred flame. He found the assembled spirits waiting anxiously for his return, their faces brightening with relief as they saw the light of victory surrounding him. "The breach is sealed," Willem reported. "The boy will recover, and the corruption has been cleansed from the chamber where it gained entrance." Sir Geoffrey nodded with satisfaction. "Well done. But this was only the beginning, a simple test of your new abilities. The real assault will come with the dawn, and it will require everything you have learned and more." Willem looked out the chapel window at the eastern horizon, where the first pale hints of sunrise were beginning to show. In that growing light, he could see shapes massing on the distant hills, an army of corruption, such as the world had never seen, preparing to test the strength of Shadowmere Castle and its newly consecrated guardian. And as the sun rose on what would become known as the Day of Trial, Willem prepared to face his greatest challenge. The dawn of the winter solstice brought with it a sight that would have driven lesser men to madness. As the sun crested the eastern hills, its light revealed the true magnitude of the force that had gathered to assault Shadowmere Castle. The entire landscape was covered with beings that had once been human, but had surrendered their humanity to the spiritual plague that swept across Europe like a tide of despair. Willem stood on the highest battlement, Dawnbreaker at his side, watching the approaching horde with eyes that could see both their physical forms and the corruption that animated them. They moved with purpose, but not intelligence, driven by a hunger for the light and hope that still burned within the castle's walls. They seek not just to destroy us, Sir Geoffrey explained, his ghostly form standing beside Willem, but to convert us, to drain away our hope and love and faith until we become like them, empty vessels for the spiritual plague to inhabit. Willem counted perhaps 1,000 of these corrupted beings, but he knew that their true danger lay not in their numbers, but in their nature. Each one was a void in the fabric of creation, a wound through which the forces of despair could pour into the world like water through a broken dam. Behind Willem, the entire population of the castle had gathered. Lord Edmund and his family, the castle guard, the servants and artisans who kept the great stronghold functioning, all looked to him with trust and hope that he prayed would prove justified. "Remember," Dame Isabella called from the chapel below, her voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "You do not fight alone. The sacred flame burns in you and through you, but also around you, in every soul that has ever served this place with love, in every prayer that has ever been offered within these walls, in every act of selfless devotion that has been performed in service to something greater than individual desire." Willem drew Dawnbreaker and raised it toward the sky. The crystal blade caught the morning sunlight and transformed it into something far more brilliant, a beacon of white fire that could be seen for miles across the countryside. As the light blazed forth from the sword, Willem felt power flowing through him from every corner of the castle, as if the very stones were offering their strength to the battle ahead. The effect on the approaching horde was immediate and dramatic. The beings in the front ranks staggered as if struck by physical blows, their forms wavering as the sacred flame's radiance reached them. Some of the corruption that sustained them began to burn away, revealing glimpses of the humans they had once been. But the force behind them pressed forward relentlessly, and Willem knew that a defensive stance would ultimately prove insufficient. The sacred flame was meant not just to guard, but to heal, not just to protect, but to reclaim what had been lost to the darkness. And so Willem made a decision that would echo through history. Instead of remaining safely within the castle's walls, Willem opened the gates and walked out to meet the corrupted horde directly. His action sent gasps of horror through the watching defenders, but the assembled spirits understood the wisdom of his choice. "The sacred flame grows stronger when it moves toward the darkness," Brother Thomas called after him. "Faith that hides behind walls, no matter how strong, cannot kindle hope in hearts that have lost their way." As Willem walked across the open ground between the castle and the approaching corruption, Dawnbreaker's radiance grew ever brighter, until he moved at the center of a sphere of light that pushed back the shadows wherever he stepped. The crystalline sword was no longer simply a weapon, but a conduit for the accumulated hope and love of 8 centuries of faithful service to the ideals that Shadowmere Castle represented. When Willem reached the front ranks of the corrupted horde, he did not raise Dawnbreaker to strike, but instead drove its point into the earth and spoke words that carried across the entire battlefield with supernatural clarity. "I am Willem de Ashford, guardian of the sacred flame, knight of the eternal watch. I come not to destroy but to heal, not to condemn but to offer redemption. Let any among you who remember what it was to hope, to love, to dream of something better than despair, step forward and be restored." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Throughout the ranks of the corrupted beings, individuals began to stagger forward, their forms wavering as the sacred flame's influence reached deep enough to touch memories of their former humanity. Some fell to their knees, weeping tears that burned away corruption wherever they fell. Others cried out in voices that remembered how to express joy instead of only hunger and rage. But not all of the horde was touched by Willem's offer of redemption. The beings at the center of the army had fallen too far into corruption to remember what they had lost, and they pressed forward with renewed fury, seeking to overwhelm the lone guardian before his influence could spread further through their ranks. Willem pulled Dawnbreaker from the earth and began to move through the battlefield, not as a warrior seeking victory through destruction, but as a healer seeking to restore what had been damaged. Each swing of the crystal blade cut through the spiritual bonds that held corruption in place, freeing souls that had been trapped within shells of despair. The battle raged from dawn until noon, not a conflict of armies, but a struggle between hope and despair, played out in the souls of 1,000 beings who had forgotten what it meant to be human. With each enemy restored rather than destroyed, Willem felt the sacred flame burning brighter within him, its influence spreading like ripples on a pond until it reached beyond the battlefield to touch other places where corruption had taken root. But Willem's greatest trial was yet to come. As the last of the corrupted beings were either restored or driven back to seek easier prey elsewhere, Willem sensed a new presence approaching Shadowmere Castle. This was not another horde of lost souls, but something far more dangerous, a being that had embraced corruption willingly, that sought not just to spread despair, but to extinguish the very possibility of hope from the world. The entity appeared first as a shadow on the horizon, a darkness so absolute that it seemed to devour light itself. As it drew closer, Willem could see that it had once been human, perhaps a lord or prince who had possessed great power in life, but had traded its humanity for the promise of dominion over the forces of corruption. "I am Malachar the Undying," the entity spoke, its voice carrying the weight of centuries of accumulated malice. "I come to claim this castle and all within it for the realm of eternal despair. Surrender now, Guardian, and I will grant you the mercy of a swift transformation. Resist, and I will ensure that your suffering echoes through eternity." Willem raised Dawnbreaker to guard position, feeling the weapon's crystal blade resonate with power that made the air itself sing. "I am Willem de Ashford, and by the authority of the sacred flame, I deny your claim. This place stands as sanctuary for all who seek the light, and no power of darkness shall claim dominion over it while I draw breath." Malachar laughed, a sound like the cracking of glaciers, and raised his own weapon, a sword forged from crystallized despair, its blade absorbing light rather than reflecting it. "Then let us see which is stronger, Guardian, the hope you cherish, or the reality of a world sliding inexorably toward darkness." The duel that followed was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. It was not merely a contest of weapons and skill, but a battle between fundamental principles of existence: hope and despair, love and hatred, creation and destruction. Each clash of their blades sent shockwaves through both the physical and spiritual realms, causing flowers to bloom or wither for miles around as the forces they wielded shaped reality itself. Willem fought not just with his own strength, but with the power of every soul that had ever served the sacred flame, their accumulated love and devotion flowing through him like a river of light. Malachar drew upon the despair of countless beings who had surrendered their hope to his influence, their anguish and hatred giving him strength that seemed almost limitless. For hours, the battle raged, neither combatant able to gain lasting advantage over the other. But gradually, Willem began to understand that victory would not come through defeating his opponent with force, but through offering him the same redemption he had extended to the corrupted horde. And in that moment of understanding, Willem discovered the true power of the sacred flame. Instead of pressing his attack when Malachar stumbled from exhaustion, Willem lowered Dawnbreaker and spoke with compassion that reached across centuries of accumulated hatred. "I see you, Malachar. I see the man you were before despair claimed you. You were a ruler who watched his people suffer and die, who felt helpless to protect those you loved most. The corruption offered you power, but it could not heal the wound in your heart. It could only make you forget that the wound existed." For the first time in their battle, Malachar hesitated, his blade wavering as memories stirred that he had thought safely buried beneath layers of malice. "What if there was another way?" Willem continued, his voice gentle but inexorable. "What if instead of spreading the pain that was done to you, you could work to heal it, in yourself and in others who have suffered similar losses?" Willem extended his hand toward his enemy, and to the amazement of all who witnessed it, Dawnbreaker's radiance began to flow toward Malachar, not as an attack, but as an offering, a chance to remember what he had been before corruption transformed him. The moment stretched like eternity as Malachar stood poised between choices that would determine not just his own fate, but the spiritual direction of the entire realm. Finally, with a sound like the breaking of chains that had bound him for centuries, the undying Lord let his dark blade fall from nerveless fingers. I remember," Malachar whispered, his voice cracking with emotions he had thought forever lost. "I remember why I wanted to protect them. I remember what it felt like to love." As these words left his lips, the corruption that had sustained him for centuries began to burn away like mist before the sunrise. His form shifted and changed, revealing not the monster he had become, but the grieving ruler he had once been. A man who had made terrible choices from noble motives and then been trapped by the consequences of his decisions. Willem stepped forward and grasped Malachar's hand in his own, feeling the sacred flame flow between them, healing wounds that had festered for lifetimes. "It is never too late to choose differently," he said. "The light you once served still burns, waiting for your return." And so the greatest victory in Shadowmere Castle's history was won not through destruction, but through redemption. As Malachar's corruption burned away completely, revealing a soul transformed by genuine remorse and renewed dedication to the light, something extraordinary happened throughout the entire region. The spiritual network that Willem had seen in Sir Geoffrey's tower began to blaze with new brilliance as healing energy flowed outward from Shadowmere Castle to restore connections that had been severed by the plague of despair. Villages that had been consumed by hopelessness suddenly found their people laughing again. Churches where prayers had fallen silent rang once more with joyful worship. Manor houses that had become fortresses of selfishness opened their doors to travelers and began to practice the hospitality that had once been their pride. Willem watched this transformation from the castle's highest tower, his enhanced vision allowing him to see the lights of hope kindling across hundreds of miles of countryside. But perhaps most remarkably, he could see other figures like himself beginning to appear at the centers of these renewed lights. Men and women who had been touched by the sacred flame's influence and were now serving as local guardians of the growing network of protection. "This is how it begins," Sir Geoffrey said, appearing beside Willem with an expression of profound satisfaction. "One light kindles another, which kindles another, until darkness itself becomes a memory." Sister Catherine joined them, her luminous form brighter than Willem had ever seen it. You have done far more than preserve Shadowmere Castle, Willem. You have begun a transformation that will spread across the entire known world. The sacred flame will not be contained within a single fortress, but will become a light that guides all humanity toward its highest potential. Willem felt a deep sense of completion settling over him, as if the great work he had been called to perform was reaching its first major milestone. But he also understood that this was not an ending, but a beginning, the first chapter of a much longer story that would unfold across generations. "What happens now?" he asked his spiritual teachers. Dame Isabella stepped forward with a smile that held both pride and anticipation. "Now you become what you were always meant to be, not just guardian of Shadowmere Castle, but founder of the Order of the Sacred Flame. You will travel throughout the lands, seeking others who can serve as guardians of the light, establishing new strongholds of hope wherever darkness has gained a foothold." Brother Thomas nodded agreement. "The Chronicle has already begun writing the next chapter of your story, Willem. There are 12 sacred sites that must be restored, 7 new temples that must be founded, and hundreds of souls who are waiting for someone to show them that despair is not the final answer to the world's suffering." Willem accepted this expanded mission with the same humble determination he had brought to his original calling as night watchman. He understood now that his true vocation was not to guard walls and gates, but to kindle hope in hearts that had grown cold, to remind humanity of its divine potential, and to serve as a bridge between the world of ordinary experience and the realm of eternal truth. Years passed, and Willem's influence spread far beyond what anyone could have imagined. In the chronicles of those who came after, Willem de Ashford's journeys became the stuff of legend. They spoke of the guardian who could restore life to blighted lands with a touch of his crystal sword, who could heal centuries-old curses with a word of blessing, who could kindle the sacred flame in hearts that had been frozen by despair for generations. But those who knew Willem personally understood that his true power lay not in supernatural abilities, but in his capacity for compassion, his willingness to see the spark of divinity that existed within even the most corrupted souls, and his absolute faith that love would ultimately prove stronger than any force that sought to divide and destroy. The Order of the Sacred Flame grew from a single guardian to a brotherhood and sisterhood of hundreds, then thousands of dedicated souls who served as beacons of hope throughout the known world. Each member was trained not just in the spiritual disciplines that Willem had learned from the ghosts of Shadowmere, but in the practical arts of healing, teaching, and community building that turned abstract ideals into concrete improvements in people's daily lives. Shadowmere Castle itself became the mother house of the Order, a place of pilgrimage where seekers came to learn the deepest mysteries of the sacred flame and to receive their own callings as guardians of the light. The castle's walls held training halls and libraries, workshops and gardens, all dedicated to the great work of nurturing human potential and preserving the flame of hope for future generations. Willem himself, though he aged in body, seemed to grow younger in spirit with each passing year. His hair turned white as winter snow. His face gained the deep lines that spoke of wisdom earned through experience, but his eyes retained the wonder and compassion that had first drawn the attention of the spirits who became his teachers. And when Willem's mortal years finally drew to their close, his transformation was as remarkable as his life had been. On a spring evening in the 43rd year of his service as guardian of the sacred flame, Willem felt the call that every mortal must eventually answer. But his passing was unlike that of ordinary men, for he had become something more than human, through his decades of service to the light. As Willem lay in his chamber at the top of Shadowmere Castle's watchtower, surrounded by the members of the Order who had become his spiritual children, the sacred flame itself seemed to descend from the chapel to attend his transition. The room filled with radiance so brilliant that it could be seen for miles across the countryside, and those with spiritual sight witnessed something unprecedented in human history. Instead of his soul departing his body to travel to whatever realm awaited beyond death, Willem's entire being, body and soul united, was transformed into pure light, becoming one with the sacred flame itself. His physical form dissolved into radiance that merged with the eternal fire, but his consciousness, his personality, his love for all creation remained intact and active. "I am not leaving you." Willem's voice spoke from the flame that now blazed at the center of the chamber, carrying the warmth and compassion that had characterized his mortal life. "I am simply changing the nature of my service. Where once I walked among you as a fellow traveler on the path, now I will be the light that illuminates that path for all who seek to follow it." The members of the Order wept tears of joy and wonder as they realized that their beloved founder had not died, but had achieved something far greater, a transformation that made him an eternal presence within the sacred flame, available to guide and inspire all future generations of guardians. And so, Willem de Ashford became the first of the luminous ones. In the years that followed Willem's transformation, other members of the Order began to achieve similar transcendence. These luminous ones, as they came to be known, formed a bridge between the earthly work of the Order and the eternal principles that guided their mission. They could communicate with mortal guardians, offer guidance in times of crisis, and even manifest physical form when the need was great. The presence of the luminous ones ensured that the Order of the Sacred Flame would never lose its way, no matter what challenges might arise in future generations. Each new guardian could draw upon centuries of accumulated wisdom and experience, learning not just from written texts and formal teachings, but from direct communion with souls who had achieved perfect understanding of their calling. Shadowmere Castle became known throughout the world as a place where the impossible became routine, where miracles were as common as sunrise, where anyone who approached with sincere desire for spiritual growth would find teachers and companions ready to help them discover their own connection to the sacred flame. Centuries passed, and the Order's influence spread to every corner of the known world. By the time of the Renaissance, when scholars began to rediscover the wisdom of ancient civilizations, they found that many of their new insights had been preserved and practiced by the Order of the Sacred Flame for hundreds of years. The Order's libraries contained texts that had been lost to the general world. Their workshops had developed technologies that seemed impossibly advanced, and their understanding of human psychology and spiritual development surpassed anything achieved by the greatest philosophers of antiquity. But perhaps most remarkably, the Order had succeeded in creating a network of sanctuaries that spanned continents, all connected by the spiritual bonds that Willem had first established during his mortal service. These sacred sites served as refuges during times of war, centers of learning during periods of intellectual darkness, and sources of healing during outbreaks of plague and pestilence. The Black Death that had originally threatened to consume Europe with spiritual as well as physical corruption found itself unable to penetrate the protective influence of the Order's strongholds. People who fled to these sanctuaries not only survived the plague, but emerged from it with renewed faith in human potential and dedication to building a better world. The persecution of the innocent, the oppression of the weak, the corruption of power, all the evils that seemed to be perpetual features of human civilization, found themselves systematically opposed by an organization that possessed both the spiritual authority and the practical capability to offer genuine alternatives. And as the modern age dawned, the Order faced new challenges that required new expressions of ancient wisdom. The Industrial Revolution brought with it unprecedented power to transform the physical world, but also unprecedented danger that this power would be used in ways that served only narrow interests rather than the common good. The Order of the Sacred Flame adapted to these new circumstances by establishing schools and workshops where the latest scientific discoveries were combined with spiritual principles to create technologies that enhanced human potential rather than diminishing it. Steam engines designed by Order engineers ran cleaner and more efficiently than those built by conventional methods. Factories established according to Sacred Flame principles provided working conditions that honored human dignity while still achieving remarkable productivity. Agricultural techniques developed in Order communities increased crop yields while actually improving soil health rather than depleting it. But perhaps most importantly, the Order began to develop new ways of organizing human societies that transcended the traditional divisions between rulers and subjects, rich and poor, powerful and powerless. Their communities served as working demonstrations that cooperation could be more effective than competition, that shared prosperity could be more sustainable than individual accumulation, and that governance based on service rather than domination could create unprecedented levels of peace and happiness. These experiments in social organization attracted the attention of reformers and revolutionaries throughout the world, many of whom came to study at Order facilities and then returned to their home countries to implement what they had learned. The great democratic revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries drew much of their inspiration from principles that had first been articulated by Willem de Ashford 7 centuries earlier. And in the 20th century, the Order faced its greatest challenge since the original plague of spiritual corruption. The world wars that devastated the early 20th century represented a new form of spiritual plague, not one that attacked individuals, but one that corrupted entire nations, turning the fruits of human civilization into instruments of unprecedented destruction. The Order of the Sacred Flame found itself called upon to serve as a refuge for those who sought alternatives to the madness that seemed to have consumed the world's political leaders. Order communities became centers of resistance to totalitarian ideologies, places where the fundamental dignity of human beings was preserved and protected, regardless of their race, religion, or nationality. The Order's long-standing commitment to transcending artificial divisions between peoples made its members natural opponents of systems based on hatred and exclusion. During the darkest days of fascist expansion, when it seemed that civilization itself might be consumed by mechanized barbarism, the Sacred Flame burned brightest in hidden sanctuaries, where scholars preserved knowledge, artists continued to create beauty, and ordinary people practiced the simple virtues of kindness and compassion that totalitarian systems sought to eradicate. The Order's influence on the Allied victory was largely invisible to conventional historians, but those with access to classified documents would later discover that many crucial decisions were influenced by advice from individuals who had been trained in Order principles, and that many of the most successful resistance movements had been organized according to methods first developed in Shadowmere Castle. And as the 21st century dawned, the Order prepared for its next great mission. The challenges facing humanity in the modern era, environmental destruction, economic inequality, the breakdown of communities, the spiritual emptiness that seemed to accompany material prosperity, All represented variations on themes that the Order had been addressing for nearly a millennium. But the scale of these challenges, and their global rather than local nature, required new approaches that honored ancient wisdom while embracing new possibilities. The Order began to work more openly in the world, establishing research centers and educational institutions that made their discoveries available to anyone willing to learn. They developed new forms of agriculture that could feed growing populations while actually restoring damaged ecosystems. They created economic models that measured success not just in terms of profit, but in terms of human well-being and environmental health. They pioneered forms of conflict resolution that addressed the spiritual roots of violence rather than merely its symptoms. But perhaps most importantly, they began to train a new generation of guardians, individuals who could carry the sacred flame into realms that previous generations could never have imagined. These modern guardians worked as teachers and healers, scientists and artists, business leaders and community organizers, all united by their commitment to serving something greater than their own individual interests. And in quiet moments, when the modern world grew still enough to listen, those with spiritual ears could still hear the voice of Willem de Ashford. Though nearly 7 centuries had passed since his transformation into the sacred flame, Willem's presence remained as immediate and vital as ever to those who served the Order he had founded. His voice could be heard in the whisper of wind through ancient trees, in the crackle of fires that warmed gathering places where people came to share their hopes and dreams, in the silence between heartbeats when souls touched the eternal truth that connected all creation. New guardians, undergoing their training at Shadowmere Castle or one of the Order's other ancient sites, would sometimes catch glimpses of a figure in white robes walking the battlements at dawn, his crystal sword glowing with inner fire as he maintained his eternal watch. These visions were not hallucinations, but moments when the veil between worlds grew thin enough to reveal the continuing presence of the one who had transformed from mortal guardian into eternal light. The journal that Willem had first opened as a nervous young man of 19 continued to write itself, its pages recording not just the events at Shadowmere Castle, but the ongoing story of all who served the sacred flame throughout the world. Each entry was written in the same careful script, each observation marked by the same combination of humility and wonder that had characterized Willem's original service. And sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, when darkness pressed close and the weight of the world's suffering seemed almost unbearable, those who carried responsibility for continuing Willem's mission would feel a presence beside them, a gentle hand on their shoulder, a voice whispering encouragement, a light kindling in their hearts that reminded them that no darkness, no matter how profound, could ultimately extinguish the flame of hope that burned at the center of all existence. For the sacred flame was not merely an ideal or a symbol, but a living reality. Those who served the Order of the Sacred Flame learned to recognize this truth through direct experience rather than theoretical study. In moments of crisis, when all seemed lost and despair threatened to overwhelm their hearts, they would feel power flowing through them that was clearly not their own. The accumulated love and devotion of all who had ever served the light, channeled through the luminous ones who had achieved perfect unity with the sacred flame. This power manifested differently for each guardian according to their individual calling and circumstances. Healers found that their touch could cure not just physical ailments, but spiritual wounds that had festered for decades. Teachers discovered that their words could kindle understanding in minds that had seemed completely closed to new ideas. Community leaders learned that their presence could transform bitter enemies into collaborating partners. But in every case, the power came not from the Guardians' own abilities, but from their willingness to serve as a conduit for something infinitely greater than themselves. The sacred flame flowed through them precisely to the degree that they surrendered their own ego and agenda to become instruments of the love that sought to heal all creation. This was the secret that Willem de Ashford had discovered in his chamber at Shadowmere Castle, the truth that had transformed him from a simple night watchman into the founder of a movement that would change the world. The recognition that every human being carried within themselves a spark of the same divine fire, and that by nurturing this spark through dedicated service, they could become living expressions of the love that was the foundation of all existence. And so, the watch continues, as it always has and always will. In the present day, as humanity faces challenges that would have been unimaginable to Willem in his mortal lifetime, the Order of the Sacred Flame continues to evolve and adapt while remaining true to its fundamental mission. The same principles that guided a young night watchman in 14th century England now inspire teachers and healers, scientists and artists, leaders and servants in every corner of the globalized world. The network of light that Willem first established through his redemption of the corrupted horde has grown to encompass the entire planet, linking millions of individuals who share a commitment to nurturing the highest potential of human civilization. They work in laboratories and classrooms, hospitals and community centers, boardrooms and refugee camps, all united by their understanding that true security comes not from walls and weapons, but from the bonds of compassion that connect all beings. And in the depths of Shadowmere Castle, the sacred flame burns as brightly as ever, tended now by guardians whose diversity of background and experience would astound the medieval monks who first kindled it. Scientists who understand the quantum mechanics of consciousness work alongside mystics who commune directly with angelic intelligences. Social activists who fight for justice in the political realm collaborate with contemplatives who battle spiritual darkness through prayer and meditation. All are welcome who come with sincere desire to serve the light, regardless of their religious background, cultural heritage, or previous experience. The only requirement is willingness to undergo the transformation that turns ordinary human beings into conscious participants in the ongoing creation of a world worthy of humanity's highest aspirations. For those who have ears to hear, the invitation remains always open. In the quiet moments that come to every human life, in the pause between sleeping and waking, in the stillness that follows great music, in the hush that falls over a gathering when someone speaks truth from the depths of their heart, the sacred flame extends its invitation to any soul ready to embrace its calling. The invitation does not come in dramatic visions or miraculous signs, but in the gentle whisper of conscience that asks, what if there is more to existence than the pursuit of individual happiness? What if your life could serve a purpose greater than your own desires? What if the love you feel in your heart could become a force that helps heal the suffering of the world? Those who respond to this invitation find themselves drawn into a current of meaning and purpose that transforms not just their own lives, but their understanding of what life can become. They discover that the sacred flame is not something external to themselves, but the deepest truth of their own being, waiting only for recognition and expression to blaze forth with the power to illuminate and warm all who approach. They learn that the Order of the Sacred Flame is not an organization to be joined, but a reality to be embodied, not a set of beliefs to be adopted, but a way of living to be practiced. They find themselves part of a fellowship that transcends all boundaries of time and space, connected not just with other living servants of the light, but with all who have ever served its cause throughout history. And in that fellowship, they encounter the presence that Willem de Ashford became when his mortal service was transformed into eternal light, not as a distant figure of reverence, but as an immediate companion on the path, ready to offer guidance, encouragement, and the unshakable assurance that no effort made in service of love is ever truly lost. The end of this chronicle is but the beginning of the next. For those who have followed Willem's journey from uncertain young night watchman to eternal guardian of the sacred flame, the question inevitably arises, what comes next? The answer lies not in any continuation of Willem's story, but in the recognition that his story was never separate from the story of every human being who has ever yearned for meaning beyond the narrow confines of personal existence. Willem's transformation was extraordinary in its completeness and dramatic in its manifestation, but it represented a potential that exists within every soul. The sacred flame that he embodied burns within every human heart, waiting only for the conditions that allow it to blaze forth with the power to transform not just individual lives, but the entire world. Those conditions are not mysterious or complex. They require no special knowledge, no exceptional abilities, no privileged circumstances. They ask only for the willingness to serve something greater than oneself, the courage to love, even when love seems powerless against the forces of hatred and fear, and the faith to believe that light will ultimately prove stronger than any darkness. In every generation, individuals discover these truths anew and begin their own journey toward the transformation that Willem achieved. Each follows a unique path determined by their particular circumstances and calling, but all are guided by the same sacred flame and supported by the same fellowship of light. The chronicles of these modern guardians are still being written, their stories still unfolding in the daily choices they make between service and selfishness, hope and despair, love and fear. Each day brings new opportunities to kindle the sacred flame in hearts that have grown cold, to offer healing to spirits that have been wounded by life's hardships, to stand as beacons of hope in a world that too often seems consumed by darkness. And each night, when the sun sets and darkness falls across the earth, the watch begins anew, not just in the ancient towers of Shadowmere Castle, but in the hearts and minds of all who have dedicated their lives to serving the light. They walk their rounds in boardrooms and classrooms, in hospitals and community centers, in laboratories and refugee camps, maintaining the vigilance that protects not just physical structures, but the spiritual foundations upon which human civilization depends. The watch continues, as it always has and always will, for the sacred flame is eternal, and its servants are as numerous as the stars in the sky. Each one carries within themselves a spark of the same divine fire that transformed Willem de Ashford from mortal guardian into eternal light, and each one represents the promise that no darkness, no matter how profound, can ultimately extinguish the love that is the foundation of all existence. In the end, we are all night watchmen, guardians of the light that burns in every human heart. And so this chronicle concludes where it began, with the recognition that the deepest truths of existence are revealed not through grand theories or complex philosophies, but through the simple act of faithful service to something worthy of our highest devotion. Willem de Ashford's transformation from uncertain young man to eternal guardian represents not an impossible achievement reserved for saints and mystics, but the natural fulfillment of human potential when it is aligned with the purposes of love. The sacred flame burns on, as it always has and always will, in the hearts of all who serve its cause. The order continues its mission of healing and hope, adapting to new circumstances while remaining true to eternal principles. And somewhere in the mists that roll across the Yorkshire moors, the light in Shadowmere Castle's highest tower continues to shine as a beacon for all who seek their way home to the truth of their own divine nature. The chronicle ends, but the story continues in the life of every reader who recognizes their own calling to serve the light. For in the end, we are all guardians of the sacred flame, all night watchmen appointed to protect what is precious and eternal in human existence, all servants of the love that creates and sustains and transforms all things. The watch continues, the flame burns, the light shines on, forever and ever, world without end.